To get better at piano and learn to play more fluidly, you need to make sure that you're learning to think slightly ahead of what you're playing and picturing what you're about to play next to the next group or chunk of notes coming up. When you don't do this, well, I find with my students that it can be one of the most common causes of mistakes, of pausing and stuttering and the rhythm being off, everything feeling difficult and awkward to play, because basically we need to be setting our hands up to play the next bit too. It's a mental thing to help you try and keep up with everything that you're playing, but it really helps you improve your technique. Okay, so I want to talk about some fundamental things this is going to help you with, things that you need to be thinking about, things that will cause mistakes when you're not thinking ahead about them, thinking ahead about the notes that are coming up next. And then you'll see that in a bunch of examples of some different kinds of situations that you will come across learning to get you thinking about how to approach this yourself. So firstly, it's going to help you use the correct fingers, because when you see the notes coming up that you need to play, you can picture your fingers falling into place much easier. With our fingering, we always need to get one finger somewhere to set up ourselves to be able to reach the next bit. The next thing is that we need to position our hands in order to reach and play things more comfortably. So when you're thinking about groups of notes at one time, it helps you get in a much better hand position. And the third thing is that it helps us move around. So if we're trying to get from point A to point B, you need to know where that point B is, and a point C as well, in order to make a smooth motion through those target points. And in general, when you can think of these groups of notes in one go, more groups in one go, you kind of chunk the information together. When you're more confident about the notes that you're playing, the next notes that are coming up, when you know the music you're playing really well, then we are much better able to relax when we play. If we're not confident in where we're going to go next, that really does cause us to tense up, and that causes mistakes and causes everything to feel difficult. And when we think about chunks of information, so groups of notes in one go, which I'll get to, then we're able to process that information, we're able to process more information much quicker. So let's look at some fingering things first. So even a really simple example, if I wanted to play this, well, I need 4 fingers to reach up there. I don't need to make a turn here. So if I started on finger 3, because I haven't thought ahead, I'm going to run out of fingers before I get to the top. And then I'm kind of stuck and I have to do something awkward to reach the top one. Whereas if I thought ahead, I can play that comfortably. Or what if this was the melody? Well, on that first half, I needed to start on finger 4 because I needed to go down 4 notes. If I started on 3, I would have run out. And I could have done that, but it just is more complicated than it needs to be. But then on the second one, I needed to make a leap up high at the end. So I wanted my thumb on the bottom so I could reach up high more easily. I wanted to start on finger 3 because I know I needed my thumb at the bottom to go up. But I needed to know what was happening later on in order to start the correct way. So when you're practicing and you're trying to get stuff really flowing, it's useful to practice in these little chunks. And then, so it's something like that. If that was in the middle of a whole piece of music, you have to think ahead and think to yourself, okay, the first one goes down and the second one goes up. So thinking ahead there helps you start on the right fingers to play that. What if I wanted to play this in my left hand? Okay, so there's 2 parts here. Firstly, I want to start on finger 3 because that allows me to get my thumb on the top. And my thumb on the top allows me to stretch and reach this more spread out part here. So I need to know from the very beginning everything I'm going to do here. Now, a really common kind of mistake that I see with students and things is that they'd probably get that bit right, and then they'd probably land on finger 4 on the G because they're only thinking about the G and they're not thinking about the fact that after the G they also need to jump down there. And the reason they put finger 4 on is because, look, it just falls into place. If my thumb's there, finger 4's kind of over the G, right? But if you think about the next couple of steps, if you know what's coming next, then you can relax and know that you have to spread out from that thumb and then use finger 2, which allows you to reach further down to the C in one fluid motion. But you have to know what's coming up next to get the movement smooth and to use the correct fingers there. It's really important, even if you're just playing scales, to think ahead as well. So if I was to play a G major scale, there's two things I want to talk about here. Firstly, when I go 1, 2, 3, thumb, like that, in order to get the movement nice between the 3 and the thumb, I kind of want to start moving through those notes like that. So I have to think about the turn on my way to the turn to get a nice movement into it. Otherwise, if I only think about my thumb going under the note before, I've got no movement coming into it, and then it's going to be really stiff and awkward. When you want to get things flowing, you kind of want to move through it. So you've always got to know where you're going next. And then with fingering, if we look at coming down scale, something that I often see is when people come down, especially if they're doing more than one octave, but I'll just do one here. They get to a point like this where they get to their thumb and they know they've got to make a finger turn over. And with these scales, it's usually 3 or 4. Sometimes people get the wrong one, and it's because they're just trying to remember. But that's not the way I like to get people to think about it. I like them to know what's coming up, to picture the next 3 notes coming up, because then you can see a block of 3 fingers fitting into there. And then you can just see finger 3 fitting in. 3 over, and then it just slots in. And that's not just useful for scales. Thinking like that helps with anything you play. The fingering feels easier to learn and to get right because you can actually see how it fits and how it makes sense. But it really does help you keep up mentally with everything that's happening and not trip over your thoughts or your fingers. So as I said earlier, thinking ahead also allows you to get a better hand position, enabling you to reach things more comfortably. So if I give you this example of one thing versus a slightly different thing. So here's the first one. So this has the C sharp on top, and then I'll do the same thing but with the D on top. Basically, you want to just know that where you're going to end up before you start. If you're going to end up on this black key, your hand needs to be a bit further when you start to make a nice line through the notes. Whereas if we're going to end up on the white key on top, your hand's going to be further back. You're making this kind of direction instead. So like I was saying earlier, you need to know your end point and your start point in order to make a nice movement from one to the other. So that angle for this one versus this angle for that one. And that's going to help you play it and move through it much more smoothly. It's really helpful to imagine what you would have to do to play those as a chord in a block, like that, versus like that. You can see how I had to bring my hand forward for that and back for that. But of course, when you're moving through, you don't want to keep your hand like that. You want to move through it. But so if you imagine the block and then kind of move through that shape, that's really helpful. And if you recognize those as chords, then it's easier to spot those blocks to start with. So this is just a D major, and this one would be what we call a D major 7. Similarly, if I was to play this phrase, I would need to know ahead of time that I'm going to lead up this way towards the C sharp so I can move in this direction towards it. Otherwise, I might end up going this direction, and then by the time I get there, my finger is too far away, and I end up having to go over the top like that. And this is how beginners can end up moving around the piano quite awkwardly because they can't see where they're going to take the most direct route. Sometimes in situations like that, your hand being in the wrong position actually causes you to play the wrong note because your hand just wants to play the note that it can reach easier. So you've got to think ahead of time and practice little phrases like that as one. So if that is a part of a song, you could just practice that bit. So when you eventually get a whole piece of music together, you could think about it as practicing little chunks and stitching them together, aiming to think of all the notes in a particular chunk in one go as one rehearsed maneuver with good fingers, movement and hand placement instead of just taking it note by note. Good hand placement really is such an important thing for beginners to pay a lot of attention to. It really can be the difference between being able to play something and not. It makes everything feel so much easier, but you do have to think ahead about the notes that are coming up. So even with a simple little shape coming down like this, here we need to be aware that we've got a couple of black keys. And if you don't think ahead, you might start with your hand position too far back on the white key plane where these fingers can't really reach the black keys very well. So you start off with your hand a bit further forward so you can reach everything comfortably, the white and the black keys. And you always need to be aware of that. We come across those shapes in melodies and really importantly in scales when we're practicing those. You have to think about this. I have a whole video on good hand placement you can watch after this. I'll put a link to that below. When we're making leaps on the piano from one position to another, you always have to be aware of your landing spot before you even lift off to move. We need to judge exactly how we're going to move there before we do it. A really useful thing for piano players to practice is moving through the different inversion positions of our basic chords, like our major and minor chords to start with. So when we do that on like a D major, for example, because there's a black note in it, as I move from this root position to this first inversion shape, the black note becomes on the bottom. So if I move through and then only realise or remember the black notes on the bottom at the last minute, look where my thumb is. If I'm moving in this line here. If I'm moving in this line here, my thumb is like that. And then what a lot of people do is they end up twisting like that at the last minute to get in there. So you have to think of all these notes as one in order to hold your hand forward and find the most comfortable position to come down on. But when you're moving from somewhere to that position, so from here to there, you want to make this kind of line with your hand because you know where you're going, as opposed to across and then up or across and then twisting. So when you know where you're going, I can go forward as I'm moving and make the transition really smooth. And again here, I come back a little bit for that one, and then that's nice from there to there. And the same on the way down. As I'm coming back down, I've got to know that's coming up. Move my hand forward and then back again for this. So again, you have to know where you're landing to make a nice movement from A to B. And that's the same in the left hand. A common way we might use the left hand is to go down from a low note up to a chord. So if I was to play this, I've got a black note on the top there. So it might be a common mistake to just go across and then look, my thumb's in an awkward spot. I'm going to have to do that. And it's all these little things like this that add tension in our playing and make everything feel difficult. Whereas if I know I'm going there, I know the good hand position I want to end up in because I'm thinking ahead, then I can make a beeline, a nice, smooth, relaxed movement. And when you stay relaxed, you stay in control of what you're playing much better. So how do you actually practice learning to think ahead? Because it does take practice. I think the main thing to do is to always break things down into little chunks, and you can practice each little chunk separately, get everything that you need for that little phrase, all the correct notes obviously, the right fingers, the right hand positioning, the right movement, practice it phrase by phrase, and then you can gradually stitch those pieces together. Each one's been rehearsed, becomes a habit, becomes automatic. And when you group things together like that, it's It's kind of like how we might remember a long telephone number. We don't say a whole stream of digits usually. We usually say something like 01625 368 769. Broken that down into 3 chunks that I can just flow through. And then it's kind of like 3 things I'm remembering in my brain as opposed to 11 digits. Each little phrase is like a manageable bite-sized chunk to get used to. Now, how you actually choose those groups is always going to be different depending on what you're playing. You have to try and find little phrases that sort of feel like they make sense. It often works well with hand positions when you have to change hand positions, but not all the time. Sometimes you can break that down into little bits. Break it down into smaller bits as you need, and you can gradually stitch them together into bigger chunks, and then you can get some bigger chunks together into the whole piece. There's room for creativity with that. You just have to be methodical and think about what works for the piece you're learning. Another useful thing to do is to practice each chunk slowly first, so you get used to being able to think ahead at a slower tempo, and then you gradually speed that up, and then slow it down again when you stitch the kind of pieces of the music together, so you get used to, you've got more time to think ahead about the next chunk that's coming up next. So as you're playing one bit, you're trying to remember the next bit, and it's useful to use some markers, so like the first note of each chunk that you've worked on and the first finger that you're going to use for that. Outside of learning an actual piece of music, you should also be spending some time practicing things like scales and chords and chord inversion positions. I've covered this stuff on the channel a lot. I'll put some links to some helpful videos down below. But really what you're doing is you're getting familiar with common musical elements that we use all the time. And then when you recognize those things in an actual piece of music, it's much quicker and easier to learn them. It's easier to recognize where you're going next. Also bear in mind that whilst we've been really talking about memorizing or learning a piece of music, thinking ahead and thinking in groups of notes at a time is also really helpful for reading and improvisation too. And lastly, just a little tip, but it's a kind of a useful one, something that just clicked with me a long time ago. When you're playing something, especially that goes over a slightly wider area of the piano, make sure that you're actually sitting up properly and you're keeping a wider field of vision. So you can't, it's a lot of people tend to look quite zoomed in a small area at a time of what they're doing. And then you've got no chance of seeing what's coming up next if what you're playing kind of spreads out a little bit. So make sure that you can see if you're going to play something wide, that you can see this whole area that you're working with. Of course, the more music you learn, the more experience you have, and the more you practice a particular piece of music as well, the easier it gets too. I hope that was helpful. Let me know in the comments below if you have any questions. And you can check out this video next for a useful exercise to lift up and move whilst keeping a relaxed wrist around the piano. That's another thing that makes playing feel a lot more comfortable and controlled. Thanks for watching.